By the time he was captured, the war was already dying. But it hadn't quite stopped killing people yet. The front lines were dissolving. Orders were contradictory or non-existent. And entire units were surrendering without knowing who was actually in charge anymore. To the outside world, the war was essentially over. Newspapers were already printing headlines about victory and peace. Cities were celebrating. But for him, everything was just beginning. He wasn't taken in a dramatic final battle or a last heroic stand. His capture happened in the confusion that follows collapse. When uniforms still exist but authority doesn't, and when the rules of war become blurry. One moment he was moving with a group of retreating soldiers, trying to avoid combat and survive long enough to get home. The next, he was surrounded, disarmed, and labeled an enemy. Despite the fact that the enemy no longer clearly existed in the way it had just days or weeks earlier. This is what makes his story so unsettling. He became a prisoner not because the war demanded it, but because the machinery of war didn't know how to shut itself off. Armies were still rounding people up, processing captives, and sending them east or west based on paperwork that hadn't caught up with reality. In that limbo between war and peace, human beings were reduced to files, numbers, and accusations. And once you were placed in that system, there was no easy way out. As peace treaties were signed and governments reorganized themselves, he remained behind barbed wire. Transferred from camp to camp, always told that release would come soon. Soon turned into months. Months turned into years. Each delay was explained away with vague phrases. Security concerns, investigations, administrative backlogs. The war had ended on paper, but its suspicion hadn't. Being captured at the end meant he wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a potential criminal, a political liability, a problem no one was eager to solve. What made it worse was the silence from the outside world. Once victory was declared, attention moved on. Former enemies were rebuilding cities, forming new alliances, and rewriting history. There was no appetite for stories that complicated the clean narrative of triumph and closure. The last prisoners didn't fit the picture of a war that had been neatly wrapped up and put away. So they were forgotten. Not deliberately, but conveniently. Inside the camps, time became distorted. Days blended together, marked not by battles or objectives, but by routines meant to control and exhaust. He watched guards change, uniforms change, even flags change, while his status remained frozen. Each new transfer came with the hope that this would finally be the one that led home. Each one ended the same way. With another fence. Another bunk, another reminder that the war had decided to follow him instead of letting him go. Being captured so late also meant there was no shared moment of defeat or surrender to process. Other prisoners had years to adjust, to form communities, to understand what had happened to them. He arrived at the end, alone in a system already winding down, where compassion was in short supply and impatience was everywhere. To the authorities, he was an inconvenience. To history, he was an afterthought. That is the cruel irony of being the last prisoner of war. The world assumes that coming last means you were spared the worst of it. In reality, it often means you absorbed the final, careless blow of a conflict that no longer had the energy to care. While peace settled in for everyone else, captivity became his introduction to the aftermath. Proof that wars don't end when the guns fall silent, but when the last human being caught in their machinery is finally allowed to step free. When release finally came, it was supposed to feel like the ending. That's how it looks in movies. The gates open, the paperwork is signed, and the prisoner walks out lighter than he went in. But for him, freedom didn't arrive as relief. It arrived as something unfamiliar, almost threatening. After years of living by orders, routines, and constant uncertainty, the absence of structure felt less like liberation and more like being dropped into open water, without knowing how to swim. Captivity had trained his body and mind in ways he didn't consciously choose. He woke before dawn without alarms, flinched at sudden movements, and scanned rooms instinctively, measuring exits and faces. These habits had kept him alive, but now they followed him everywhere, long after they were needed. Freedom didn't erase them. It exposed them. In public spaces, he felt watched even when no one cared. In quiet rooms, his thoughts grew louder than they ever had behind the wire. There was also the guilt. Heavy, irrational, and relentless. He had survived when others hadn't, and survival came with questions he couldn't answer. Why him? Why now? The war was over, but the accounting never seemed to stop. Every small comfort felt undeserved, every moment of calm temporary. He carried the sense that peace was something that could be revoked at any moment. Just like freedom had been delayed again and again in captivity. The hardest part was realizing that the damage wasn't visible. People expected gratitude, resilience, maybe even pride. They saw a man who had made it through and assumed the story ended there. But inside, something had shifted permanently. Emotions didn't come when they were supposed to. Joy felt muted. Anger arrived without warning. He struggled to explain this to anyone. Partly because the language for psychological trauma barely existed at the time. And partly because he didn't fully understand it himself. In captivity, feelings had been dangerous. Hope could lead to disappointment. Attachment could be taken away. Vulnerability invited exploitation. So he learned to shut things down, to stay emotionally neutral as a form of self-protection. The problem was that once learned, those defenses didn't simply turn off. Back home, they made relationships feel distant and exhausting. Conversations stayed on the surface. Silence became easier than explanation. Sleep offered no escape. Nights brought fragments of memory. Sounds, faces, moments that made no sense out of context but carried enormous emotional weight. He didn't always dream of violence. Sometimes it was the waiting. The endless uncertainty, the feeling of being trapped in a system that refused to acknowledge him. He would wake with his heart racing, disoriented, already tired before the day had begun. What made it more isolating was the expectation that survival equaled strength. Admitting that he was struggling felt like failure. After all, the war was over. Everyone else was moving forward. Reconstruction was happening. Families were rebuilding. There was no room in that narrative for a man who had returned but hadn't really come back. So he learned to perform normality. To smile when expected, to downplay his experiences, and to carry the weight quietly. This is why survival wasn't freedom. The camp gates opened, but the war had rewired him. It had shaped how he thought, how he reacted, how safe the world felt. He wasn't broken in a way that could be seen or easily repaired. He was altered. And that alteration became the real sentence he carried home. A reminder that the deepest wounds of war don't always come from what happens on the battlefield, but from what stays with you when it's finally over. Coming home was supposed to be the moment everything made sense again. The place, the language, the faces. This was where life had been paused, waiting for him to return. But almost immediately, it became clear that home had continued without him. Streets looked familiar yet slightly wrong. People had aged, routines had changed, and conversations moved at a pace he struggled to follow. He was back, but the world he remembered no longer existed in the same way. There was no ceremony waiting for him, no collective pause to acknowledge what he had endured. The war had already been processed, packaged, and placed firmly in the past. For everyone else, it was a chapter that had closed. For him, it was still happening internally, unfolding in quiet moments and unexpected triggers. When people asked how he was, they expected a simple answer. Fine. Lucky. Glad to be back. Anything beyond that made them uncomfortable. He quickly learned that his experiences didn't translate well into everyday conversation. How do you explain years of waiting, uncertainty, and powerlessness to people whose greatest struggle had been scarcity or inconvenience? When he tried, words felt inadequate, almost embarrassing. The scale of what he carried inside didn't fit into polite exchanges over meals or casual reunions. So he stopped trying. Silence became the safest option. Even within his own family, there was distance. They had imagined his return for so long that they had filled in the gaps themselves. The person who came back didn't match that image. He was quieter, more guarded, less reactive. Small disagreements felt overwhelming. Loud laughter felt intrusive. Moments that were meant to be joyful made him feel like an observer rather than a participant. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that he didn't know how to re-enter emotional closeness without feeling exposed. Society expected productivity, gratitude, and forward motion. There was work to be done, lives to rebuild, futures to plan. Trauma wasn't part of the equation. There were no systems designed to help someone untangle years of psychological damage. The unspoken message was clear. The war is over, so act like it. And on the surface, he did. He found work, followed routines, blended in. But internally, everything felt provisional, as if stability were a temporary illusion. Public spaces could feel hostile in subtle ways. Crowds made him tense. Authority figures triggered reflexive compliance or suspicion. He struggled with the freedom to make choices, something captivity had slowly stripped away. Even simple decisions. Where to go, what to do next. Felt heavy. In the camps, life had been reduced to survival. Back home, life demanded engagement, and that demand felt overwhelming. What hurt most was the lack of recognition, not in the form of praise but understanding. His suffering didn't fit the heroic image of wartime sacrifice. Nor did it align with the public's desire to move on. He wasn't visibly wounded, and he wasn't outspoken. That made him easy to overlook. Over time, he began to feel like a stranger in the very place that was supposed to anchor him. Home, instead of offering refuge, felt unpredictable. Almost like enemy territory in its own way. Not because it was hostile, but because it expected a version of him that no longer existed. Every interaction required translation, restraint, and performance. He learned how to function, but not how to feel at ease. The distance between who he was before the war and who he had become was never openly acknowledged. Yet it shaped everything. In that quiet gap between expectation and reality, his isolation deepened. He wasn't imprisoned anymore, but he wasn't free either. He had returned geographically. But emotionally and psychologically, he was still negotiating hostile ground. Trying to survive in a place that assumed survival was already enough. Calling him the last prisoner of war suggests a clean ending. As if history closed a door behind him and moved on. But for him, and for countless others like him, that door never really shut. The war didn't end with release papers or train tickets home. It simply changed shape. It moved from barbed wire and watchtowers into memory, habit, and silence. What followed wasn't peace so much as a different kind of battlefield. One with no clear enemy and no official end date. Years passed, and outwardly, life appeared stable. He worked, aged, occupied space in the world like everyone else. But the war remained present in subtle, persistent ways. Certain sounds still pulled him backward in time. Authority still carried an edge of danger. Uncertainty still triggered the same physical tension it had in captivity. These reactions weren't choices. They were echoes. Automatic responses etched into him when survival had depended on them. What made this lasting war especially cruel was its invisibility. There were no medals for endurance after peace. No recognition for carrying on despite a mind that refused to let go. Psychological trauma didn't announce itself. It whispered. Disrupted sleep, strained relationships, and quietly narrowed the boundaries of what felt safe. From the outside, he looked like a man who had returned and resumed life. From the inside, he was still negotiating terms with a past that refused to stay in the past. Over time, his silence became part of the legacy. He didn't talk much about what happened. Not because it wasn't important, but because there never seemed to be the right moment or the right listener. That silence didn't end with him. It filtered into family dynamics. into emotional distance, into patterns that those around him felt but didn't understand. Trauma has a way of traveling forward, shaping generations without ever naming itself. This is why the idea of a last prisoner of war is misleading. Official captivity may end, but psychological captivity can persist indefinitely. Many who survived wars returned home carrying internal conflicts that never made it into history books. They became veterans of a war that no longer existed publicly, fighting battles that had no language and no audience. As the years went on, the world increasingly framed the war as something resolved. A lesson learned, a tragedy contained within dates and memorials. But for those who lived through it in captivity, the war was personal, ongoing, and unresolved. It lived in how they trusted. Or didn't. In how they loved cautiously. In how they reacted to stress long after danger had passed. Eventually, age softened some edges, but it didn't erase the imprint. Memory doesn't operate on a timeline the way history does. It collapses decades into seconds. A smell, a phrase, a look can reopen doors that were never fully closed. And each time, the body reacts before the mind can intervene, reminding him that survival came at a cost that peace never fully repaid. So when we call him the last prisoner of war, what we're really doing is comforting ourselves. It allows us to believe that war ends, that suffering has a final chapter, and that time heals everything. His life tells a different story. One where freedom and captivity coexist. Where peace is negotiated daily, and where the true end of war isn't marked by treaties, but by whether the people who survived it are ever truly allowed to be free.